The dense silence of the forest was brutally interrupted by the panic of a blind girl, lost and alone. An FBI agent and his K9 found her, but what the dog did next, ignoring the victim to stare into the void with a furious growl, was not what the agent expected. That unusual reaction shocked the officer and revealed a danger no human eye could perceive. Mark Evans felt a shiver run down his spine. Blade's guttural growl, vibrating in the humid forest air, was not a sound he associated with common danger. His eyes scanned the darkness between the trees, where Blade fixed his gaze, but there was nothing. Only shadows dancing with the gentle breeze. The girl, still crying, shivered with cold and fear, oblivious to the tension that had settled between the man and the dog. "Blade, what is it, boy?" Mark murmured, his voice tense. He crouched, trying to redirect the German shepherd, but the dog remained unyielding. The bristling hairs on his back were an unmistakable sign of imminent threat. A subtle scent, almost imperceptible to Mark, floated in the air, and Blade tracked it with chilling precision. Suddenly, without warning, Blade lunged, not at the darkness that so disturbed him, but at the worn backpack the girl clutched tightly to her chest. A sharp bark escaped the dog as his sharp teeth tore through the fabric with controlled yet relentless ferocity. Mark was paralyzed for an instant, shock freezing his muscles. "Blade, no!" But it was too late. The backpack sprang open, revealing its contents. Among some toys and a snack, a small rectangular object fell onto the damp earth. A voice recorder. The moment it hit the ground, a dry click echoed, and a whispering voice, cold and metallic, filled the forest's silence. "I'll be back for her." The phrase, repeated in a disturbing loop, froze Mark's blood. It wasn't an animal, it wasn't an illusion. It was a kidnapper. The realization hit him with the force of a punch to the gut. The girl wasn't lost. She had been abandoned, a pawn in a cruel game, monitored by someone waiting for the right moment to return. Blade's invisible enemy wasn't a forest creature, but the malevolent intent that permeated that small device. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. Blade's uncanny instinct, his ability to perceive the hidden danger in the recorder's scent and the intent behind it, had saved the girl from a horrifying fate. The dog, now calmer but still vigilant, looked at Mark as if to say, "I told you so." With his heart pounding, Mark acted. He carefully picked up the recorder, using his shirt sleeve to avoid contaminating potential evidence. The voice still echoed, a chilling reminder of the threat. He knelt beside the girl, who was now sobbing harder, the sound of the recorder terrifying her even more. "It's okay, sweetie. You're safe now," he murmured, gently pulling her into a protective embrace. The scent of wet earth and pine mingled with the child's scent of fear. He grabbed his radio, and his voice, firm but with palpable urgency, called dispatch. "This is Evans. I need immediate backup at my location. I've found a kidnapping victim. Repeat, kidnapping. And we have evidence." The forest, once a sanctuary of peace, had transformed into a crime scene, a labyrinth of secrets. The voice on the recorder was just the first thread of a much larger web. Mark knew this wasn't a routine patrol. It was the beginning of an investigation that would unravel a network of crimes and expose the dark secret the forest held in its depths. The darkness between the trees now seemed denser, laden with the promise of still unknown dangers. The distant sound of a siren, still faint, promised the arrival of help, but also the start of a hunt. The wail of sirens, once a distant lament, transformed into a deafening crescendo, tearing the veil of the forest's silence. Blue and red lights pulsed through the dense foliage, painting the trees with ghostly flashes. Mark held the girl tighter, shielding her from the noise and lights that would soon invade their precarious refuge. Blade, now sitting beside them, watched the approach with renewed calm, but his eyes remained fixed on the trail from which help was nearing. The first to arrive was a local police patrolman, breathless, his radio still crackling in his hand. Behind him, more FBI agents and paramedics hurried, their steps breaking twigs and crushing the damp earth. The scent of pine and wet soil was quickly replaced by the metallic aroma of equipment and the subtle scent of paramedics' disinfectant. "Agent Evans, what do we have here?" The grave voice of an FBI agent with a supervisor's badge cut through the air. It was Special Agent Miller, a veteran with tired but sharp eyes. Mark handed the girl over to a soft-spoken paramedic, who immediately began talking to her in soothing tones. "A kidnapping victim, Agent Miller. I found her lost, and we have evidence." Mark extended the recorder, wrapped in his shirt sleeve, the kidnapper's whispering voice still echoing in his mind. "Blade found her. He also found this." Miller took the device with gloved hands, his eyes narrowing as he listened to the recording. "I'll be back for her." The chilling phrase filled the small clearing. A shiver ran down Miller's spine. "This is unusual, Evans. Very unusual." As forensic technicians began to cordon off the area, stretching yellow crime scene tape between the trees, Mark explained to Miller the sequence of events. Blade's growl at nothing, the attack on the backpack, the discovery of the recorder. He emphasized the dog's almost supernatural perception. Miller, though a man of science and logic, listened intently, the seriousness of the situation undeniable. "We need a full sweep of the area," Miller ordered, his voice low but firm. "Every inch, and I want a search and rescue team ready to go in." Blade, oblivious to the human commotion, sniffed the ground near where the girl had been found. His whiskers twitched, picking up trails imperceptible to human eyes. He stopped, sniffing a clump of matted grass, then looked at Mark, a soft bark escaping his throat. It wasn't an alert bark, but an indication. "He found something," Mark said, pointing at the dog. "Blade isn't just sniffing, he's reading the history of this place." One of the forensic technicians approached, kneeling where Blade indicated. "It looks like someone was here recently, Agent Evans. The grass is matted in a peculiar way, and there's a slight depression in the soil, as if someone had lain here for a while." The confirmation chilled Mark. The kidnapper hadn't just abandoned the girl, he had watched her. The darkness of the forest, which once seemed a protective cloak, now revealed itself as a hiding place for malevolence. The voice on the recorder wasn't an empty threat, it was a promise of return, and the criminal was nearby, perhaps even now, watching the scene unfold. The forest, once silent, now echoed with the crackle of radios, voices, and the sound of boots on the earth. The investigation had begun. Mark felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. The girl was safe for now, but the danger Blade had detected was far greater than a single kidnapper. That recorder was the tip of an iceberg, and the depths of the forest promised to reveal even darker secrets. The hunt had truly begun, and every shadow seemed to hide a clue or a new danger. The forensic technician carefully marked the spot Blade indicated, a small flag planted in the soft earth. A camera clicked, recording the depression in the grass, the exact spot where the kidnapper had lain, observing. The air, already heavy with the forest's humidity, seemed to grow denser, laden with the recent presence of malevolence. Mark felt a shiver run down his spine. The thought that the criminal had been there, perhaps just minutes before, lurking in the shadows while he comforted the girl, was deeply unsettling. "Let's expand the search perimeter," Miller ordered, his voice low but urgent. "K9 teams, move in. I want every bush, every fallen log checked. He can't have gone far." Additional scent dogs, accompanied by their handlers, were released, their muzzles to the ground, following invisible trails. The rustling of leaves and the snapping of twigs intensified as agents spread through the woods. The crackle of radios filled the space, communicating coordinates and observations. The paramedic, a gentle woman named Sarah, had managed to calm the girl. She was wrapped in a thermal blanket, small sobs still shaking her body, but her eyes, veiled by trauma, were now simply closed in exhaustion. "She's in shock," Sarah explained to Mark, her voice soft. "We need to get her to the hospital. She hasn't said a word, but she's physically unharmed, apart from some minor abrasions." "Any identification?" Mark asked. Sarah shook her head. "None. No documents in the backpack, just the recorder." Mark nodded, watching the girl being carefully placed on a stretcher. Before she was taken away, he approached. "You're safe now," he whispered. And for an instant the girl's lips moved, an inaudible sound escaping. Miller approached Mark, the recorder in a clear evidence bag. "The audio lab will prioritize this. We want to know if there's anything else on the recording, background noises, anything that might give us a clue about his identity or location." "And what did Blade find?" Mark asked, looking at his partner, who was now lying down, but with his ears alert, watching the movement of the other dogs. "Besides the depression in the soil, we found some tiny fabric fibers and a faint scent of nicotine," Miller replied. "It's not much, but it's a start. The perpetrator might be a smoker, and the fibers could lead us to a type of clothing or upholstery." Mark felt a pang of frustration. So close, yet so far. The kidnapper had been there, just meters away, and had now vanished like a ghost into the vast darkness of the forest. "We'll have to set up a command post here," Miller continued, gesturing to a more open area. "This isn't an isolated incident, Evans. The way he left the girl, the recording, there's a method here. He wanted us to know he'd be back. It's a message." The sound of an approaching helicopter cut through the air, its blades beating forcefully, making the tree leaves sway. An aerial search team was arriving, adding a new dimension to the hunt. Blade stood up, his eyes fixed on the helicopter's direction, then on the dense curtain of trees. He barked once, a sharp, insistent sound, different from his previous barks of indication. "What is it, boy?" Mark asked, kneeling beside the dog. Blade wasn't looking at the helicopter, but at a deeper point in the forest, where sunlight barely penetrated. "He's sensing something," Mark told Miller, his voice tense. "It's not a scent trail, it's something else." Miller watched Blade, a wrinkle of concern on his forehead. He had witnessed the dog's precision before. "Search and rescue team! Focus in that direction! Agent Evans, you and Blade lead the way!" Mark placed his hand on Blade's harness. The dog, with his fur slightly bristling, began to move forward, not sniffing the ground, but with his head held high, as if detecting something in the very air, a premonition only he could decipher. The scent of pine and damp earth intensified with each step, mingling with a new, subtle and strange odor that Mark couldn't identify, but which Blade clearly perceived. The forest seemed to swallow them, the trees closing in on them like a cage. Daylight faded, replaced by a perpetual twilight beneath the canopy. The helicopter's sound receded, leaving them once again with the forest's noises and the agent's hurried footsteps. Blade stopped abruptly, a low, guttural growl escaping his throat. His eyes were fixed on an opening between the trees, where a dark, shapeless structure loomed, almost indistinguishable from the vegetation. A strong, metallic smell, mixed with something putrid, hit Mark, making him recoil. It wasn't the smell of an animal, but something more sinister. "Hold up!" Mark shouted to the agents behind him. "Blade found something, and it's not good." The darkness in the opening seemed to suck in the light. Whatever was there did not belong in nature. The hunt had led to a discovery far more disturbing than a simple hideout. The forest was about to reveal its darkest secret. The pungent metallic smell, mixed with the cloying sweetness of putrefaction, gripped Mark's throat, turning his stomach. Blade, body tense and a continuous growl, didn't move, his yellow eyes fixed on the darkness between the trees. There, camouflaged by dense foliage and undergrowth, loomed a shapeless structure covered with dark tarps and dry branches, almost invisible until one was just a few feet away. It wasn't a cabin nor a hunter's tent. It looked more like a scar on the landscape, a tumor silently growing on the forest's skin. "Blade, let's go," Mark whispered, his hand on the dog's harness. Blade's growl intensified, but he moved forward, guided by an instinct Mark could barely comprehend. With each step, the smell grew stronger, more oppressive. As they approached, the structure revealed itself as a haphazard pile of wood and rusted metal, barely covered by dirt and moss. A narrow opening, almost a slit, revealed an interior of absolute darkness. "Agent Evans, what have you found?" Miller's voice cut through the air, followed by the hurried footsteps of other agents. "It's a structure, Agent Miller. Looks like an improvised bunker," Mark replied, his voice hoarse, the smell invading his nostrils. "And the smell! It's terrible." Miller and his team arrived, their flashlights piercing the darkness. The beams of light danced over the structure's rough surface, revealing the precariousness of its construction. One of the agents, a forensic technician, approached cautiously, covering his nose with his hand. "It's an organic smell, Agent Miller," the technician said, his voice muffled. "But it's not from a dead animal. It's different." Blade, ignoring the commotion, poked his snout into the dark slit, a sharp bark escaping. He scratched at the earth around the opening, unearthing a piece of dark-soaked cloth. Mark knelt, picking up the fabric with gloved hands. It was a piece of a garment, perhaps a tunic, with strange symbols embroidered in dark red thread, resembling dried blood. The fabric was heavy, of a coarse weave, and the smell of putrefaction seemed to emanate from it. "What is this?" Miller asked, his voice tense, his eyes fixed on the symbols. "It doesn't look like it's from around here," Mark replied, feeling a chill. "And the symbols, they're unfamiliar." Another agent's flashlight illuminated the slit's entrance. The interior was a narrow tunnel, dug into the earth, descending into darkness. The smell was almost unbearable now, a mix of mold, dirt, and something indefinable, evoking a sense of visceral repulsion. "No one goes in without full protective gear," Miller ordered, his voice firm but with a tone of alarm. "And I want a canine team with cadaver dogs ready to enter. This smell—" He shook his head, his expression grim. "This isn't a common kidnapper's hideout, Evans." Mark looked at Blade, who was now sniffing the piece of fabric with unusual intensity, a low, continuous growl in his throat. The dog's eyes were fixed on the red symbols, as if he could read the history imprinted there. "He's sensing more than just the smell, Agent Miller," Mark said. "He's sensing the presence of evil." As the agents prepared, the distant sound of a news helicopter began to cut through the air, buzzing like a giant insect. The media was approaching, drawn by the buzz of the investigation. Miller cursed under his breath. "We need to cordon off this area completely," he said. "No one but our team can approach. And we need a hazmat team. This smell isn't normal." Mark nodded, his gaze fixed on the darkness of the slit. He knew the forest had held dark secrets, but what lay behind that entrance promised to be far worse than anything he could have imagined. The girl's voice on the recorder, the threat of return, the strange symbols on the fabric. Everything was beginning to fall into a disturbing pattern. The hunt for the kidnapper had transformed into an incursion into an unknown abyss. The search team, now equipped with gas masks and protective suits, positioned themselves at the slit's entrance. The cadaver dogs, trained to detect the odor of death, were agitated, their barks echoing in the woods. Mark felt his heart pound in his chest. Whatever lay beneath, it was about to be revealed. The forest, with its treacherous beauty, had finally yielded its most terrible secret. The dazzling light of the flashlights danced over the gas masks and white protective suits of the hazmat team as they prepared for entry. The smell, even through the filters, was a nauseating slap. a mixture of advanced decomposition and something chemically caustic that burned the nostrils. Blade, his snout still on the piece of fabric with the symbols, let out a low, keen whimper, a vibration that seemed to resonate with the darkness of the slit. Team Alpha, move in. Maintain visual and radio communication. Agent Evans, Blade, you're right behind them. Don't touch anything without authorization, Miller ordered, his voice distorted by the radio in his helmet. The first hazmat team member, a robust man with the name Davis emblazoned on his chest, disappeared into the dark opening. A crackle on the radio indicated he was moving. Narrow tunnel, Agent Miller. Descending. The smell is intense in here. Zero visibility without the flashlights. Mark placed his hand on Blade's harness. "Let's go, boy," he whispered. The dog, with his fur bristling, advanced into the slit, his lean body barely fitting through the opening. Mark followed, feeling the damp, cold earth brush against his shoulders. The darkness was absolute, swallowing the flashlight's beam just a few feet away. The air was heavy, stagnant, and the sound of their own breaths seemed amplified inside his helmet. The tunnel opened into an irregular underground chamber, roughly excavated from rock and earth. The walls were damp and slippery, and the flashlight's beam revealed a scene that made Mark's stomach churn. In the center of the chamber, there was a low, crude stone table covered with more pieces of the same dark fabric with red symbols. Around the table, arranged in a circle, were objects of bone and wood, some with strange engravings, others stained with a dark, dried substance. "Agent Miller, we're in a main chamber," Davis reported, his voice tense. "It appears to be a site for rituals." Blade stopped, his eyes fixed on a corner of the chamber, a deep, continuous growl in his throat. He wasn't sniffing the ground, but seemed to be staring at an invisible presence. Mark followed the dog's gaze. There was nothing there, just the damp earth wall. But Blade was unyielding, his muscles tense, as if ready to strike. "What's he seen, Mark?" Miller asked over the radio, his voice laden with apprehension. "I don't know, Agent Miller, but he senses something we can't see," Mark replied, feeling a shiver run down his spine. The smell of putrefaction was overwhelming, now mixed with a sweet metallic odor that Mark recognized with horror. Blood. One of the forensic technicians, equipped with gloves and tweezers, began to examine the stone table. "There are organic residues here, Agent Miller. Blood samples and what appears to be human tissue. And these symbols. They're painted on some of the stones and bone objects." Another agent's flashlight illuminated a small alcove in the wall. There, haphazardly piled, were several items, children's clothes, old toys, and a pair of child's dark glasses, identical to those the blind girl wore. A sob escaped Mark's throat. "We found the girl's belongings, Agent Miller," Mark reported, his voice choked. "Clothes, toys, and her glasses." A heavy silence fell over the team. The implication was clear. The girl hadn't just been abandoned. She had been brought to this place, a site of indescribable horror, before being left in the forest. The kidnapper wasn't just a common criminal. He was part of something much larger and more sinister. Blade suddenly yelped, a sharp, painful sound, and recoiled a few steps, bumping into the wall. He cowered, his eyes fixed on the same dark corner, as if the invisible presence had become unbearable. "Blade! What is it, boy?" Mark asked, kneeling beside the dog, checking if he was injured. The dog trembled, but there were no visible injuries. It was as if he had been struck by something only he could perceive. "Agent Evans, what's happening to Blade?" Miller asked, his voice tense. He's reacting to something very strong, Agent Miller. Something that's scaring him," Mark replied, standing up. That corner of the chamber now seemed colder, denser. "This place, it's not just a hideout," the forensic technician said, his voice almost a whisper. It's an altar, and the dark substance on the bone objects. It's a mixture of blood and other fluids. The symbols, Agent Miller, are consistent with sacrificial rituals. The distant sound of the news helicopter intensified, an insistent buzz that seemed to mock the darkness and horror contained within. The hazmat team began to meticulously collect samples, each movement slow and deliberate. Mark looked at Blade, who was now calmer, but still with a look of apprehension at the dark corner. The dog had detected evil, not just the smell of death, but the very essence of human cruelty. The forest had yielded its secret, and it was more heinous than anyone could have imagined. The girl's kidnapper wasn't a lone wolf, but part of a web of darkness that extended far beyond the forest's limits. What they had found was just the beginning. The silence in the underground chamber was heavier than the earth that enveloped them, broken only by the occasional crackle of radios and the distant hum of the helicopter outside. The forensic technician's revelation that this place was an altar of sacrifices, stained with blood and human tissue, hung in the air like a chilling miasma. Mark felt a knot form in his stomach, a mixture of horror and revulsion that choked him. He knelt again beside Blade, who was now lying down, his body still trembling slightly, eyes half closed but still fixed on the dark corner. There were no visible injuries, but the dog's distress was palpable. "Are you okay, boy?" Mark whispered, stroking Blade's bristling fur. The dog responded with a low whine, a rough vibration that seemed to echo the chamber's darkness. Blade wasn't just scared, he was wounded by something that transcended human comprehension. "Agent Evans, we need you here." Miller's voice sounded over the radio, more urgent now. Mark stood up, his gaze sweeping the chamber. The flashlight's beam danced over the bone and wood objects, revealing grotesque details, carvings that seemed to represent distorted figures, horned animal heads, and what appeared to be rudimentary depictions of children. The red symbols on the fabric and stones seemed to glow with a light of their own, a silent promise of pain and suffering. The symbols. They're not random. The forensic technician, a man named Dr. Aris Thorne, explained, his voice grave and tense. He pointed to a stone panel on the wall where the same symbols were etched. They're repetitive, a pattern, and what appears to be an ancient language, perhaps a rudimentary form of runic script mixed with ideograms. He pointed to a particular symbol, a spiral with an eye in the center. This one. It appears on almost every object. It's a symbol of observation, of vigilance, and in some cultures of sacrifice to open the eyes. Mark looked at the symbol, feeling a chill. The whispering voice on the girl's recorder, the promise to be back for her, the act of leaving her alone in the forest to be monitored. It all connected. They were watching her, Mark said, his voice hoarse. It wasn't just a kidnapping. It was part of a ritual. Miller nodded, his grim expression visible behind the gas mask. This is far beyond anything we've ever seen, Evans. We need cult experts, ancient symbology specialists, and we need a full sweep. We can't miss a single detail. He looked at the alcove where the girl's belongings were. The girl. She was the target. But why? As the hazmat team collected samples, Dr. Thorne continued to examine the artifacts. He picked up a small bone amulet covered with the same symbols and the dark substance. This substance, preliminary analysis indicates it's a mixture of human and animal blood, but there are also traces of something else. A plant resin and a type of ground mineral. It's a binder used to fix the symbols and imbue them with power in their belief. Suddenly, one of the K9 search team agents who had brought his dogs into the chamber let out a muffled shout. "Agent Miller, I found something." All eyes turned to the agent, who was kneeling near the opposite wall, where the earth seemed looser. His dog, a robust German shepherd, barked incessantly at a specific spot, scratching the earth with ferocity. Mark and Miller approached. The agent pointed to a small, almost imperceptible crack that opened in the earth wall. "It looks like another passage. Agent Miller, it was covered." Mark felt his heart quicken. The darkness didn't end there. The forest had yielded a secret, but it seemed to unfold in even deeper layers. Blade, who had stood up and approached, sniffed the new opening. This time, his growl was different, not of fear but of contained fury. He scratched at the earth, pushing his snout into the crack. "It's another tunnel," Mark said, his voice tense. "And the smell. It's stronger here." Dr. Thorne approached, his flashlight illuminating the opening. "This tunnel seems older, Agent Miller. The walls are natural rock, not excavated. And the air, it's colder, as if coming from something much deeper." The sound of the helicopter outside became deafening, a constant reminder that the outside world was about to invade the horror they had discovered. Miller cursed again. "We don't have time. Agent Evans, Blade, you and your K9 team enter this new passage. Watch out for traps and maintain visual and radio communication. I want to know what else this thing hides." Mark nodded, a shiver running down his spine. He looked at Blade, who was already ready, his eyes fixed on the darkness of the new passage. The dog had sensed evil and now seemed determined to confront it. The hunt for the kidnapper had transformed into a descent into an abyss that promised to reveal not just a criminal, but a cult, an organization operating in the shadows, driven by ancient beliefs and heinous rituals. What they would find in the next chamber could be the key to unraveling the web of darkness that enveloped the forest, or it could lead them to an even greater danger. Mark clipped his tactical flashlight to his vest, freeing his hands, and nodded to the other two K9 agents who would accompany him, each with their German shepherd. The space was narrow, forcing them to move in single file. Blade, at the front, slid through the crack with surprising agility, his muscular body brushing against the damp rock walls. The air there was dense and cold, laden with the smell of wet earth and an ancient mold that seemed to impregnate the very bones. "Stay alert," Mark whispered into the radio, his voice muffled by the closeness of the walls. "Anything, no matter how small, report it." The tunnel opened into a steep descent, the uneven floor covered with small loose stones and slippery sludge. The agents' flashlights danced in the darkness, revealing jagged rock formations and fissures that disappeared into the depths. The sound of dripping water echoed, creating a macabre symphony that intensified the sense of isolation. Blade wasn't growling, but his steps were cautious, his snout low, sniffing the air intensely. His eyes gleamed in the beam of Mark's flashlight, fixed on something human eyes couldn't discern. The invisible presence that had scared him in the main chamber seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a grim determination in the dog's demeanor. He was in hunt mode. "What do you feel, boy?" Mark murmured to Blade, who responded with a low whine and a slight wag of his tail, without averting his gaze from ahead. After a few meters of descent, the tunnel widened slightly, and the natural rock walls gave way to sections where the earth seemed to have been excavated, though more crudely than the previous chamber. Here and there, marks of primitive tools were visible, deep scratches in the rock. "Agent Miller, we're in an excavated tunnel, but it seems much older than the main chamber," Mark reported, his voice tense. "The walls are unstable. Watch out for collapses." The radio crackled with Miller's reply. "Understood, Evans. Keep pace, but safely. Anything new?" "Not yet, Agent Miller, just the feeling that this place is very, very old," Mark replied, feeling a chill. Suddenly, Blade stopped abruptly, his body tense, a low, continuous growl rumbling in his throat. The other two K9 dogs, who were right behind, also stopped, sniffing the air and emitting muffled barks. Mark directed his flashlight to the spot where Blade fixed his gaze. On the damp earth wall at eye level, there was a new symbol painted with the same dark, reddish substance they had found on the artifacts in the main chamber. It was the spiral with the eye in the center, but this one was larger, more grotesque, and seemed to pulsate in the flashlight's beam. And below it, there was something else. Embedded in the earth, a small wooden object. Mark approached, extending his gloved hand to pick it up. It was a doll, crudely carved, with childlike features, and the same eye symbol etched on its forehead. A piece of stained and faded fabric was tied around the doll's neck. "Agent Miller, we found a doll," Mark reported, his voice choked by the discovery. "Made of wood, with the same observation symbol, and it has a piece of fabric tied to it. It appears to be child's clothing fabric." A heavy silence fell over the radio. "Are you saying it's another one of the girl's belongings?" Miller's voice sounded hoarse. "I can't be sure, but the implication is clear," Mark replied, feeling the weight of the object in his hand. "It wasn't just a doll, it was a message, a warning. And this symbol, it's painted directly on the wall, Agent Miller. It looks fresh." Blade, still growling, scratched at the earth beside the symbol, revealing a small protrusion. Mark knelt, illuminating the spot. It was a small hole, covered by a thin layer of earth. He poked his finger in and felt something hard. Carefully, he removed the earth, revealing a small metallic device, thumb-sized. It was a sensor, a microphone, or perhaps a tracker. "Agent Miller," Mark said, his voice barely a whisper. "They knew we were coming. This tunnel, it's a trap, or a guided path." An alarm blared in Mark's earpiece, a sharp, insistent sound coming from Miller's radio. "Evans, get out of there! The news helicopter! It exploded!" The ground trembled beneath Mark's feet, a dull roar reverberating through the tunnel walls. Dust and small stones fell from the ceiling. The darkness ahead seemed to deepen, and Blade's growl intensified, now laden with uncontrollable fury. It was no longer fear, but a wild urgency. The cult wasn't just in the shadows. They were active, and the helicopter explosion was a declaration of war. Whatever awaited them further down the tunnel would not be a peaceful encounter. The ground twisted with the force of the explosion, and a deafening roar swallowed the tunnel. A shower of dirt and small stones plummeted from the ceiling, raising a suffocating cloud of dust that blinded the agents for an instant. Mark hunched over, shielding his head with his arms, while the sharp, insistent sound of Miller's alarm continued to pierce his ears. "Evans, repeat, the news helicopter! It exploded! Get out of there! It's a trap!" Miller's voice was laden with panic and fury, but the sound was quickly muffled by a new tremor, more violent than the last. A loud crack echoed through the rock, and a deep fissure opened in the side wall, releasing a jet of cold, damp air. The other two K9 dogs howled, recoiling slightly, but Blade, with his fur bristling and a guttural growl that seemed to come from the depths of his soul, advanced a step, sniffing the new fissure with wild intensity, his eyes, red in the flashlight's beam, fixed on the opening darkness. "Agent Miller, we're under attack! The tunnel is collapsing!" Mark shouted into the radio, his voice strained by the vibrating ground. Blade found another passage. It seems to have opened with the explosion. "Don't go in, Evans. It could be an ambush. Turn back." Miller's order was clear, but the urgency in Blade's voice was stronger. The dog scratched at the rock with his front paws, pushing his snout into the newly opened crack, a low, anxious whine escaping his throat. There was no fear in his growl, only a directed fury, a relentless determination. Mark looked at the other two K9 agents. Their dogs were restless, but didn't show the same urgency as Blade. That dog sensed something they didn't, a threat that transcended physical danger. "We can't go back, Agent Miller. The passage behind us might be blocked." And Blade, He wants to go. He senses something. Mark made a quick decision. Time was running out, and the cult had just declared war. To retreat now would mean giving up the advantage. We'll follow Blade. Keep your distance. Stay alert. He nodded to the other agents, who, though hesitant, assented, trusting Mark's instinct, and even more, Blade's. Mark tucked the doll and the sensor into his vest pocket. The spiral with the eye on the wall seemed to watch them, a silent promise of more horrors. Blade slid through the crack, his muscular body disappearing into the darkness. Mark followed, his tactical flashlight cutting through the gloom. The new passage was even narrower and more irregular than the previous one, with raw rock walls that seemed to have been shaped by nature and time. The air was colder, denser, and laden with a metallic and earthy smell, like dried blood and minerals. Water droplets trickled down the walls, and the sound of dripping was constant, muffled only by the agent's careful footsteps and Blade's continuous growl. The tunnel sloped downwards at a steep angle, and the floor was covered by a thick layer of sludge and loose gravel, making each step a perilous task. "Agent Evans, what do you see?" Miller asked, his voice now more controlled but still tense. "We're on a steep descent, Agent Miller. The walls are natural rock, very old. There are no signs of human excavation here, just nature. And the smell. It's different, stronger." Mark swallowed hard. The smell was almost palpable, a mix of mold, earth, and something more, something Mark couldn't identify, but which made his stomach churn. Suddenly Blade stopped, his body tense, his growl transforming into a low, continuous bark directed forward. The other two canine dogs also stopped, their barks echoing in the confined space. Mark illuminated the spot where Blade fixed his gaze. The rock wall opened into a natural cavern, much larger than the previous chamber. His flashlight's beam revealed a cavernous space, with sharp stalactites and stalagmites projecting from the ceiling and floor, forming grotesque shadows. In the center of the cavern, there was an imposing rock formation that resembled a primitive altar. On the altar there were several objects. Mark approached with Blade, the other K9 agents maintaining guard. The flashlight's beam revealed the macabre details. Human skulls, yellowed by time, were arranged in a circle with the same spiral and eye symbol painted on their foreheads. Around the skulls there was a pile of bones, some small, others larger, all with marks of cuts and scratches, and in the center of the circle of skulls rested a small object. It was a cloth doll, old and faded, with one eye torn out and the same spiral symbol painted on its forehead. A piece of dirty and torn cotton fabric was tied around its neck. It was the same type of fabric that had been tied to the wooden doll Mark had found. A cold shiver ran down Mark's spine. The doll wasn't just an artifact, it was a representation, a symbol of their victims. And what was even more disturbing, the cloth doll was damp, as if it had been recently washed. "Agent Miller, we're in a natural cavern. There's an improvised altar with human skulls and bones and a cloth doll with the same symbol. It appears to be the girl's doll." Mark's voice was a whisper, barely audible over Blade's growl. A heavy silence fell over the radio, before Miller's voice sounded, hoarse and filled with horror. "Evans, are you sure?" "Yes, Agent Miller. The fabric, it's identical, and the symbol, it's the same." Mark felt a knot in his throat. The brutality of the ritual, the coldness with which they had transformed innocence into a symbol of their cult, was nauseating. Blade, who was sniffing the altar with contained fury, let out a sharp, strong bark, pushing his snout into a crevice at the base of the rock formation. Mark illuminated the spot. The crevice was narrow, but wide enough for a dog, and from within it came an even stronger, more putrid smell. "Agent Miller," Blade found another crack. "The smell, it's unbearable here." Mark felt bile rise in his throat. Whatever lay beyond that crack was the source of the evil Blade had sensed from the beginning. The hunt for the kidnapper was over. Now it was a descent into the heart of darkness. Mark felt bile rise in his throat, but the wild urgency in Blade's eyes was undeniable. The dog pushed his snout into the crack, a low, hoarse whimper escaping his throat. There was no choice. The putrid smell was a macabre invitation to the abyss Blade already sensed. "Agent Miller, we're entering the crack. The smell is unbearable, and Blade is desperate to go," Mark reported, his voice tense. He knelt, his tactical flashlight fixed on the dark opening. "It's narrow, barely fits a man. Be careful, Evans. We don't know what awaits you in there," Miller warned, his voice cut short by brief static. Mark urged Blade into the crack. The dog wriggled, scraping his back against the damp rock, disappearing into the darkness. The other two K9 agents stood guard in the main cavern, their dogs growling, but without Blade's same uncontrollable fury. Mark took a deep breath, the heavy, nauseating air filling his lungs, and began to crawl. The passage was even tighter than he'd imagined, the cold, damp rock against his body, the smell of decomposition and metallic minerals becoming overwhelming. Every inch was a struggle, claustrophobia tightening its grip on his throat. He heard Blade's scratches ahead, the muffled sound of his body moving. The flashlight, clipped to his helmet, illuminated only a small stretch of raw rock, revealing slippery moss and dark mineral veins. The tunnel sloped downwards, and Mark felt the sludge slide beneath his knees and elbows. The smell intensified with each advance, a mix of putrefaction, damp earth, and something sweet and cloying, like dead flowers. It was the smell of death, but also the smell of a ritual. Suddenly, the passage opened slightly. Mark slid forward, emerging into a smaller chamber, an irregular and cramped space where the darkness seemed denser, more oppressive. His flashlight's beam swept the area, and what he saw made his stomach churn. There was no altar here, no arranged skulls. This was the disposal chamber, the place where horror became real. In the center of the packed earth floor, there was a shallow depression, and within it a shapeless mass. It was a pile of small bodies, some skeletal, others in different stages of decomposition, wrapped in dirty cloths and tied with coarse ropes. Most appeared to be children. The smell was so potent here that Mark felt his eyes water and a bitter taste filled his mouth. Blade stood beside the pile, his body rigid, a continuous low growl vibrating in his chest, his red eyes fixed on a specific spot in the mass of remains. Mark approached, his breath caught in his throat. He illuminated what Blade was staring at. Among the small skeletons, there was an object that didn't fit the scene of horror. It was a small wooden toy, a miniature rocking horse, crudely carved, but with unmistakable childlike features. And tied around the rocking horse's neck was a piece of fabric. It was the same faded and torn fabric Mark had found on the wooden doll and the cloth doll. "Agent Miller, we found..." "What they did," Mark whispered into the radio, his voice choked by revulsion and shock. The sound of his own voice seemed to profane the heavy silence of the chamber. "It's an improvised graveyard. Bodies of children, and there's a toy here, with the same fabric. It's hers, Miller. The girl. She wasn't the first, nor the last." A sepulchral silence fell over the radio, broken only by Mark's heavy breathing and Blade's low growl. The horror of the discovery was overwhelming. The cult didn't just kidnap, they sacrificed. And the blind girl, abandoned in the forest, was just a piece in their macabre game, a bait, a warning, or perhaps a miraculous survivor of a fate that awaited her here. The hunt had become a mission to rescue lost souls, and the heart of darkness pulsed with the pain of innocence. Mark's voice, choked by revulsion and shock, echoed over the radio, revealing the unspeakable horror of the chamber. A sepulchral silence swallowed the line, broken only by the agent's heavy breathing and Blade's low, continuous growl. The image of the small bodies, The child's toy, the familiar fabric, everything merged into a macabre tapestry that tore at the soul. "Miller, did you hear me?" Mark whispered, his throat tight, the cloying sweetness of decomposition still clinging to his nostrils. "I heard you, Evans." Miller's voice finally came through, hoarse and laden with palpable grief. "My God, hold your position. We're sending reinforcements, but it will take time for them to reach you. Don't touch anything. Just observe." "Observe?" Mark retorted, incredulity coloring his voice. "Miller, this isn't a common crime scene. This is hell. They're sacrificing children. The blind girl. She was an exception, not the rule. She escaped by a miracle." Miller's silence was a tacit agreement. The reality of the situation was overwhelming. The mission had transformed from a hunt for a kidnapper to an incursion into a murderous cult, whose roots seemed to extend deep beneath the forest. Mark felt a shiver run down his spine. The claustrophobia of the chamber, the weight of those lost innocent lives, everything conspired to make him retreat. But Blade wouldn't retreat. The dog, his body still tense and fur bristling, wasn't focused on the pile of remains. His red eyes, which seemed to penetrate the darkness, were fixed on a narrow crack in the opposite wall of the chamber, from which a muffled, almost imperceptible sound emanated. A sound Mark, in his shock, hadn't noticed before, a low, rhythmic hum, like a distant chant or the murmur of voices. Blade let out a sharp bark, a sound of urgency that cut through the heavy air. He pushed his snout into the crack, scraping the rock with impatience. The smell emanating from there was different from the chamber's smell of death. It was stronger, more chemical, with the same sweet and cloying touch Mark had sensed before, now mixed with smoke and something metallic, almost electric. Blade found another passage. There's a sound, a hum, and the smell is different. It's like they're active, close by, Mark reported, his voice now firmer, driven by adrenaline and Blade's determination. "Evans, don't risk it. Wait for reinforcements," Miller pleaded, the concern clear in his voice. "I can't, Miller. Blade won't wait. What if they're in there? What if there's someone else? More children?" Mark argued, already kneeling to assess the opening. The crack was even tighter than the previous one, almost a fissure in the rock, but Blade was already wriggling to get through. "Be careful, Mark, please," Miller said, the use of his first name revealing the gravity of the moment. Mark switched off his radio, the decision made. There was no waiting. Every second could mean the difference between life and death for another victim. He urged Blade forward, who disappeared into the darkness with a swift scramble. Mark took a deep breath, the air heavy with smoke and ritualistic odors filling his lungs, and began to crawl. The passage was a tunnel of claustrophobic agony. The cold, damp rock scraped against his body, and the humming sound became more distinct, louder. It was a chant, yes, human voices intoning something repetitive and guttural, mixed with the crackle of a fire. The smell was overwhelming, strong incense, smoke, the cloying sweetness, and a pungent odor of fresh blood. Mark crawled for what felt like miles, the flashlight on his helmet barely piercing the dense darkness. The tunnel opened abruptly. Mark slid out, falling to one knee, his flashlight sweeping the area. He was in a cavernous chamber, much larger than any they had found so far. It wasn't a natural cave. The walls were smooth in places, with inscriptions and symbols painted in dark red. The air was warm and dense, and the sound of the chanting was deafening. In the center of the chamber, there was a crackling bonfire, its flames dancing and casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Around the fire, in a circle, stood hooded figures, swaying in a rhythmic trance. Their voices united in a sinister chorus, filling the space with a palpable and terrifying energy. Blade was crouched beside Mark, his body tense but strangely silent, as if the shock of the scene had muted him. His eyes fixed on a point beyond the fire, where a rustic stone altar stood. On the altar, there was an object. Mark's flashlight beam flickered, revealing the most disturbing image of all. It wasn't skulls, nor bones, nor dolls. It was a small, rusty, makeshift metal cage. And inside it, huddled, was a child. A girl. She wasn't blind, but her eyes were blindfolded with a dirty cloth, and her lips were gagged. Her body trembled slightly with the rhythm of the chant, and a trickle of blood ran from her arm, staining the white fabric of her nightgown. The chants intensified, and one of the hooded figures approached the cage, holding a ceremonial knife that gleamed in the firelight. Mark felt his blood run cold. He had arrived too late for the other children, but not for this one. Blade's growl finally erupted, a sound of pure, uncontrollable fury that cut through the air, drowning out the chants. The hunt was over. The descent into darkness had reached its climax, and Mark Evans was in the heart of hell, mere seconds away from a sacrifice. Mark's blood ran cold, but his years of FBI training took over. Blade's growl was a primal scream, a declaration of war against the darkness that enveloped them. The cultists, caught by surprise, faltered in their rhythmic swaying. Their guttural chants fragmented, some turning their hooded heads towards the source of the interruption. The figure with the ceremonial knife paused, hand hovering over the rusty cage. "FBI, hands up!" Mark bellowed, his voice hoarse, cutting through the sudden silence in the chants. He charged without waiting for a response. His flashlight beam swept the cavern, momentarily blinding some of the figures. Blade was a blur of motion, a dark projectile launched directly at the cultist holding the knife. A yelp of pain erupted as Blade's powerful jaws clamped down on the cultist's arm, tearing the weapon away and sending the figure sprawling to the ground. Chaos erupted. The remaining cultists, jolted from their trance, began to stir, some advancing towards Mark, others recoiling in confusion. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows that transformed their hooded forms into monsters. Mark didn't hesitate. He reached the altar, his hands fumbling with the rusty latch of the cage. The metal groaned, resisting his efforts. The girl inside let out a whimper, a small sound of terror escaping her gagged lips. A cultist, larger than the others, lunged at him, a heavy wooden staff raised. Mark ducked, the staff whistling past his ear, and countered with a swift kick to the cultist's knee. A sickening crack echoed in the cavern, and the figure collapsed with a muffled cry. Blade, having disarmed the first cultist, was now a whirlwind of fur and teeth, snapping at the legs of anyone who dared approach Mark or the cage. His growls reverberated, a symphony of protective fury. The latch finally gave way with a tortured metal screech. Mark wrenched open the cage door and gently pulled the trembling girl into his arms. She was small, incredibly light, her body convulsing with shivers. He quickly tore the dirty blindfold from her eyes, revealing wide, terrified blue eyes that blinked rapidly, adjusting to the dim, flickering light. He ripped the gag from her mouth, and she gasped, breathing deeply and tremulously. "It's okay. I'm here to help you," Mark whispered, his voice soft despite the frantic pounding of his heart. He held her close, shielding her as he tried to back away from the altar. The cultists, though momentarily disoriented by Blade's ferocity and Mark's sudden attack, were regrouping. Their chants began to rise again, though more disjointed. Now filled with rage, a group of them, perhaps 5 or 6, began to advance, their movements more deliberate, their faces hidden by their hoods. They weren't armed with ceremonial knives, but with crude wooden staffs and stones. The air grew thick with palpable malevolence. Mark knew he couldn't fight them all while protecting the child. He needed an exit, and fast. His eyes scanned the cavern. The entrance he had come through was a narrow crack, impossible to navigate quickly with a child in his arms. But then he saw it, a wider opening, partially obscured by a hanging tapestry woven with dark and disturbing symbols. On the opposite side of the chamber, across from the altar, it looked like another tunnel, potentially larger. "Blade!" "With me," Mark commanded, his voice sharp. Blade, ever obedient, disengaged from a struggling cultist and returned to Mark's side, a low growl still vibrating in his chest. Mark squeezed the girl tighter, her small hands clutching his uniform. He began to move, a calculated retreat towards the obscured passage, keeping the fire and the cultists between him and his objective. The cultists closed in, their numbers making them bolder. A stone whizzed past Mark's head, hitting the cavern wall with a dull thud. Blade barked a warning and bit the nearest cultist's leg, forcing him to stumble. Mark moved with desperate urgency, his gaze fixed on the tapestry. The fire's heat was intense, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke, blood, and the cloying sweetness of ritualistic incense. He reached the tapestry, tearing it aside with one hand, revealing a dark, gaping mouth of a tunnel. It was wider, thank God, and sloped downwards. He didn't know where it led, but it had to be away from this hell. "Let's go, girl," he murmured, gently pushing her ahead of him. He felt a sharp blow to his shoulder as he entered the tunnel, a staff striking him. But he ignored the pain, focusing only on getting the girl to safety. Blade, a loyal shadow, followed closely, his growls echoing in the darkness as he covered their retreat, snapping at the heels of the pursuing cultists. The chants, now a furious roar, diminished slightly as they plunged deeper into the new passage, leaving the hell of the ritual chamber behind. But the darkness ahead was unknown, and the danger was far from over. Mark gently pushed the girl ahead of him, the tunnel swallowing them into a damp, cold darkness. The blow to his shoulder still throbbed, a sharp pain spreading through his arm, but he ignored it. The furious growls of the cultists, which had previously seemed an incessant roar, faded to a distant echo, but the sense of danger remained. The girl, still trembling, clung to his shirt, her small hands clenching with surprising strength. Her blue eyes, now unveiled, were wide, trying to adjust to the gloom that Mark's flashlight barely managed to pierce. The tunnel was wider than the previous crack, allowing Mark to walk hunched over instead of crawling, but it was uneven and slippery. Moisture dripped from the walls, and the smell of mold and wet earth replaced the incense and blood of the ritual chamber. The floor was uneven, with loose stones and puddles of cold water. Mark felt the girl's body shrink even further against him, with every sound the darkness produced. The dripping of water, the rustle of something unseen in the shadows, the very sound of his cautious footsteps. Blade, always ahead, but constantly turning back, maintained a low, continuous growl, a silent warning. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, focused on something Mark couldn't see, but which he trusted was there. The dog was Mark's compass and shield in that subterranean labyrinth. The passage began to descend more abruptly, turning into a steep ramp. Mark had to support the girl more firmly, his boots slipping on the wet stones. "Almost there, little one. We're getting out," he whispered, more to himself than to her. He didn't know if it was true, but hope was a necessary tool. Suddenly, Blade stopped, his growl intensifying to a sharper sound, almost a muffled bark. His fur bristled. Mark raised his flashlight, sweeping the beam ahead. The ramp opened into a larger area, not a chamber, but a kind of natural cavern, much older and less worked than the previous ones. However, it wasn't empty. In the center of the cavern, there was a series of rudimentary but functional electronic equipment. Wires stretched across the floor, connecting car batteries to video monitors, displaying grainy images of other tunnels and chambers. There was a communication radio, crackling with static, and a makeshift table with maps and notes. It was an observation post, an improvised command center, and someone was there. A figure, not hooded like the cultists, but wearing dark utilitarian clothes, was hunched over one of the monitors. It was a man, corpulent, with a sparse, dirty beard. He seemed focused on the images, oblivious to Mark and Blade's presence. In his hands, he held a small remote control. The smell emanating from that space was the same chemical and electrical scent Mark had noticed before, mixed with the cloying sweetness. The same smell Blade had detected in the original crack. This man, he realized with a chill, was the mind behind the surveillance, the observer, the kidnapper who had abandoned the blind girl in the forest. Blade, without waiting for an order, advanced, not in a full attack, but in a calculated move, a deep growl reverberating through the cavern walls. The man sharply raised his head, his eyes wide with surprise. He tried to lift the remote control, perhaps to activate an alarm or trap, but Blade was faster. The dog leaped, knocking the man from his chair with a dull thud. The remote control flew from his hands, falling and shattering on the stone floor. The man cried out, a sound of surprise and pain, as Blade immobilized him, biting his arm with precision, but without intent to kill. It was a capture, not an execution. Mark held the girl tighter, shielding her from the confrontation. His eyes swept the cavern, searching for other threats. There was no one else. The man was the only one here. With the man under Blade's control, Mark approached, his flashlight focused on his face. "Who are you? Where are the others?" Mark demanded, his voice laden with anger and exhaustion. The man, his arm bleeding under Blade's firm jaws, spat on the ground, his eyes, full of hatred and defiance, fixed on Mark. "You won't stop them. The ritual. It will be completed. The forest will awaken." His voice was hoarse, but laden with a disturbing conviction. Mark felt a shiver down his spine. The forest will awaken. What did that mean? He looked at the broken monitors, at the scattered maps. There was more than he imagined. The network was larger, more complex. He noticed something on the maps. They weren't just tunnels and caverns. There were marked points of interest on the surface, sites of smaller rituals perhaps, and a thick line connecting them all, converging on a central point. The point where the first girl had been found, the point where it all began. The girl in his arms let out a small sound, a muffled sob. Mark held her tighter. He had rescued a child, captured one of those involved. But the sense of victory was ephemeral. What the man said echoed in his mind. The ritual. The forest will awaken. A new sound, distant but unmistakable, began to fill the tunnel behind them. It wasn't the growl of the cultists, nor the crackle of the radio. It was the sound of sirens, reinforcements. They were close. Mark looked at the man on the ground, then at the girl in his arms. The darkness still held many secrets, but light was finally arriving. But at what cost, and what exactly would awaken in the forest? The real battle, he realized, was just beginning. He had to interrogate this man. He had to understand what was happening.